When was the last time you watched a great film? You struggle to really think of watching a movie recently that's really moved you in a significant way. And it is quite a paradox because if you consider today, we've got all these streaming sites, all these options, like for example Netflix, and we live in an age where movies on demand can easily find it and watch it anywhere. And there's been a proliferation of movies made. Yet it seems to be quite rare that a movie has really moved us in an emotional way, a true masterpiece. And this is at odds with the fact that if you consider there's been so much progression in filmmaking, for example, improvements in VFX technology, of course the equipment, and with the maturing of the industry as a whole, you'd imagine that we'd reach this peak of filmmaking. Yet it seems to be that movies today are increasingly passable, increasingly soulless. They seem to be experiences that once we're done watching them, we tend to forget about them. They don't really move us in any significant way. Now, why is that? And this really got me thinking. You see, production companies behind movies, they of course want to make great movies, movies that speak to people, and they want to improve the craft of filmmaking. Conventionally, they've always relied on these story consultants, as they're called, these script consultants, the people that actually offer advice and overlook and oversee script writing and the actual story building itself. And these are people like, for example, Robert McKee, who's a very famous story consultant based in Hollywood, who's actually written a book called Story. And the sort of consulting advice that McKee gives in his work and of course through his book are tips like, for example, that something significant and gripping must happen by page 27, or other suggestions like it's very important to have protagonists that are very active rather than passive. Specifically, he advises that the protagonist has to be actively moving towards a goal, whatever it may be, or the movie will fail to engage its audience. And of course, when you think of advice like that, you can already immediately think of many films that abide by principles like that. Another famous story consultant like Blake Snyder would give advice about character building and screenwriting, advice such as the fact that you have to have protagonist characters that highlight a quality that the audience will appreciate. For example, the protagonist should do something that is heroic, or overcoming some sort of a challenge that people will appreciate, perhaps a sense of personal weakness to ultimately become someone better. This hero's journey. Now, once again, as I refer to Snyder's advice, we can immediately think of many films that abide by that sort of principle. And of course, these advice are encapsulated in their books, but they very well represent the sort of approach that Hollywood has taken. Because if you really were to think about these principles, they tend to apply in almost every modern movie that we have really watched. Movies nowadays at the big cinema tend to be things that immediately engage us with these gripping stories about these heroes, these significant events, and they very much feel like roller coaster rides. But if one thing is certain, it's that they tend to have a certain formula to them. Because if you really to consider all the modern movies that you've watched recently, they might be about different things, but they tend to feel the same in many ways. And not surprisingly, because they tend to follow the same formula. Yet, you might be surprised to learn that this formula isn't actually very new. The formulaic approach towards story building actually traces itself all the way back to ancient Greece, to the great philosopher Aristotle, whose book Poetics was really an attempt to analyze how Greek tragedies were actually composed. And Aristotle actually broke that down into the concept of the three-act structure of how stories should be made. And of course, many of the principles and the advice of story building can be traced to many of these revelations that Aristotle discovered. Yet the formulaic approach towards movie making has become even more emboldened by the fact that today, many of these production houses, because of technologies, they've got data analytics. They're able to really tell what the trends are, who audiences may engage with in terms of the actor, and also what sort of structures in terms of plot would best engage with the audience. And hence, movies today, they now are even more systematically made than before. Technically speaking, that should be a good thing. If we can find out what is the best formula towards making an enticing story, naturally, that should ensure that these stories are, in fact, gripping and enticing. Yet, I can't be the only one that feels, despite going through all this machinery, all these formulas that should ensure success for movie making, movies today seem to be so soulless. You can't deny they're very thrilling when you're actually watching it. It's almost like being on a roller coaster, but it doesn't actually stay with you. It doesn't actually speak to you in a very significant way. And this is where I actually discovered a lot of very interesting independent filmmakers and their views and also their books, where they really talk about a totally different and contrary approach towards this growing machinery of movie making formula. For example, the director behind one of my favorite films of all time, The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, Charlie Kaufmann, he despises the formulaic approach towards filmmaking. He rejects the belief that filmmakers should follow a template, because according to him, more important than finding the perfect and systematically guaranteed design of plot, character, conflict, and story structure are originality and authenticity. He argues that if we use a blueprint to make films and tell stories, these movies will become predictable and, in fact, paradoxically dishonest. They will feel like films that were really assembled in the factory without any involvement from anything remotely human. And they are dishonest because they're more concerned with the craft of storytelling and getting that down systematically perfect, rather than they are with real life, with the story itself. You see, according to people like Kaufman and another great author, Evan Pushak, good movies, the ones that really stick with us, they are more than just designing a great character or a great plot with all these conflicts that grips you in. Stories are actually vehicles that make acute observations about humanity. They show us things about ourselves that we didn't know. They teach us how to articulate the things that we might be thinking about, that might be on the surface of just our consciousness, perhaps our collective consciousness, things that are inexplicable to us, perhaps even unintelligible, yet they hit it right on the spot. In other words, they are a lens into humanity itself. They are incredibly human. So when we have the modern films that are being made nowadays, they are a deviation from this by the furthest extent. Rather than being a lens on the human experience, these films, they observe the human experience itself, not through reality, but through the lens of other movies, through the craft of movie making alone. As a result, as Evan puts it very well in his writing, many films today are an alternate reality that is only a dim echo of our own true reality. And Lee Kaufman, in his own views, actually shared that good filmmaking is about expressing who you are. It's to say who you are in your life, in your work. It's to tell somebody out there, somebody that you might not even know, maybe somebody 500 years from now, in the future, they find who you are and your experience of being human, and that your story will be a record of your time. And perhaps by being honest, we might appeal and connect with other people out there, part of this very real human experience. Now, what is very interesting, I think, is that if we look at the recent history of the filmmaking, especially just within, let's say, the last 2 decades, I think in the periods of the 2000s and the 2010s, we really see a domination of Hollywood big blockbuster films. And then after that, from 2010s to 2020s, we've actually seen a renaissance of independent filmmaking. Suddenly, these independent filmmakers were incredibly creative, with their own stories to tell that were traditionally rejected by the Hollywood system because they did not appeal to the formulaic criterions of filmmaking. Suddenly, these filmmakers were being accepted by the sudden emergence of these streaming production houses like Netflix. And that is a great thing. We've actually seen films made by Martin Scorsese, the Coen brothers, the Safdie brothers, Spike Lee, and of course, Charlie Kaufman. Great films like, for example, The Irishman. Films that did not rely on the explosions, the thrills of the big screen and all these crazy moments, but films that actually told a very real story. And these filmmakers that were with their projects that were previously being rejected by Hollywood for not complying to the formulaic approach of what a blockbuster should be, suddenly they were given a chance to make their really great films, and we've seen them. But unfortunately, in the recent few years, just very recent, Netflix has actually declared, and not just Netflix actually, a lot of the other production houses under these streaming sites have actually declared that they'll be focusing more on films that appeal to mass audience, films that naturally, as you would imagine, are approved by story consultants and goes through the formulaic machinery. For example, The Grey Man, recently released, a blockbuster released by Netflix, was actually made by the Russos, who were behind the Marvel Endgame and Infinity War franchise. And so we start to see films that are more similar to the sort of Hollywood blockbusters that we have been seeing almost every quarter. In fact, it's reached such a stage now that not just with the streaming giants, streaming sites, but overall, we are seeing movies that are being made that are completely unoriginal, to be honest, that seem to be regurgitations of things done before. And I think what is most sad is to see sudden sequels and continuations being made of truly great films at one point, and suddenly we have a sequel that's basically a regurgitation of the previous great film, but now devoid of all the original storytelling. As long as it fits the formula, it's now being made. Now, I wouldn't consider myself a cinephile, I wouldn't consider myself a true movie critic, but I think it's quite fascinating if you really consider what's actually happening and why we are increasingly finding it very difficult to find films that truly speak to us. And it's just part of the wider commercialization of one of the most creative industries, filmmaking. And of course we see this nowadays in also other industries. And I think it's also us that may be part of the problem, because sometimes when we are so used to the certain convention of films that we watch where we expect something to be happening by the first 15 minutes of the film, that we give no chance to truly great stories that are being told by the more independent but perhaps more creative and truly thought-provoking filmmakers out there. And that perhaps if we have a bit more patience towards actually appreciating these great stories too, perhaps we might be surprised ourselves and realize that we don't necessarily need to infuse data and consistency in everything we do, rather that we should appreciate the humanity and creativity that may represent the art alone.